Hi everyone, I'm back with a solo mini-sode today all about strong-willed kids. If you guys have been following me on social or on my email list, you know I've been talking a lot about this lately, and it's because so many of you have so many questions about it. And I kind of wrote about this in an email recently, but I've worked with several children who we would categorize as strong willed, if you will. So today I'm going to share really quickly three key things or key points that I really want every parent to know if you're finding yourself raising a child who just feels like everything's a battle. They're really, they demonstrate defiance, they push against boundaries, everything might feel like an uphill battle. They really struggle to regulate their emotions. They are what I call my fair fighters. They're constantly kind of keeping score of like, well, you did that for sister. Now it's my turn. It's not fair because they got to do it 3 days ago. Now it's my turn to do it. They kind of remember everything and they're constantly keeping stock of like, what's in it for them. So I want to highlight three sort of key points that come up over and over, be it in one on one coaching when I'm working with families or in a group coaching program. These points come up a lot. So I thought I could illustrate them on the podcast. Also, I just posted on TikTok a couple of days ago, and the post went really viral. And I talked about the first point that I'm going to get to. So clearly, I realize that the need is there. And so if you guys have more questions about strong willed kids after this episode, feel free to reach out to me. And also, if you're on my email list, you already know this, but I'm going to be doing a group coaching program beginning on November 21st. Registration for it begins, I want to say November 12th, but don't quote me. But if you're just get on my email list and you'll know. And I want to say when this podcast episode comes out, doors might be open, so you'll be able to access it, assuming it doesn't close. I cap the group at a smaller number because I want it to be an intimate group. I like when I do group coaching where I can get to everybody's needs and questions and things of that sort. So the best thing to do really is make sure you're on my wait list always, or just on my email list, so that way you're notified when those wait lists open. Sometimes those groups fill really quickly and I don't even always go on social about it. So just a key point to kind of keep in mind. But anyways, I'll be doing a group coaching program talking about how to raise a strong-willed child while also learning about emotional regulation for both you and your child. And that's some of the points that I'm going to highlight today. So what I was getting at the top of the podcast when I was saying is that I posted this video on TikTok and it's obviously doing really well. And that's why I brought it up on the call today or on the podcast today. And it's essentially what I'm doing is I'm talking about this idea that most parents adopt a sort of, well, I call it the approval based model of parenting. And that just means we give our kids a set of directions or we ask them to do something, and our expectation is that we will gain cooperation or we should get cooperation back. And honestly, a lot of kids do this. You just say, hey, you need to clean up your toys, and they say, okay, and they clean up their toys. A lot of kids are compliant. And so when we have a child who isn't, it's often a little jarring. Like, why aren't you just listening like the other kids? But how boring would it be if everyone was the same, right? Like I always say, strong willed kids for me have always been my favorite. I've worked with so many throughout the years. And part of why I love them so much is that they almost have this like toughness about them, and they can be hard to win over. But then once you win them over, I just feel like you're in, and they love just as much as they fight. And so there is this capacity in them to really feel all the feelings, right? Even the ones that are happy and joyful and all the good things. And they can also feel very kind of aggravated and frustrated and mad and angry and sad, and the things that can feel a little bit harder for parents to deal with. So with that, I talked about this idea of like an approval model. And that is essentially where you give your child a set of directions. Like I said, they listen, they cooperate, you're very happy, and they want your approval. So for them, the value is that they see that you're satisfied with the fact that they listened, they did something for you, and that feels rewarding to them. That feels good to them. That makes them feel safe. Now, if you have a strong willed child, they don't value approval, and that doesn't make them good or bad or anything like that. We don't want to necessarily bucket things into good or bad, right? Because I can talk about the flip side of a child who really values approval. Down the road, we do run into some challenges around, well, who exactly do you want that approval from, right? We want to teach those kids to kind of balance that out. And while it's beautiful that they can be respectful of others' needs, We don't want it to happen so much so that it's at the detriment of their needs, or they're no longer able to tune into what they need or make choices for themselves. So again, we're kind of taking both of these things and bringing them into balance. So now a child who is strong-willed does not value approval. It's not important enough to them. Meaning, if you give a set of directions and they don't listen, your disapproval of their choice does not deter the behavior because it's really not that valuable. They kind of don't care. They actually want to see how far can they push, how much can they manipulate their environment, how much can they affect change. They're much more sort of curious, and they want to know what's going on, and they kind of want to know their power relative to everybody else. And that's why I always say strong-willed kids value power. Now, I learned this from somebody that I absolutely love in the space, who's Joe Newman. He talks about this exact idea of an approval-based style of parenting versus power, a child who really seeks power. And I will link the episode because he's been on the podcast twice, but I will link it in the show notes so that you guys can go back and listen to it if you haven't. But he's the one who really came up with this idea of like, some kids want approval, some kids really want power. So now if you have a strong-willed child and you know that they value power, what they're really trying to see is, how much power do I have? How much power do you have? And what ends up happening is, as they exert their power, because they are still children, because they are still developing, they don't have the capacity to self-regulate their emotions. So what ends up happening is their power very quickly moves them into a state of no control. And now what they're really trying to see is, who can hold me in this state? I don't mean physically hold, but who can hold the space for me while I work through this? What boundary can I butt up against? What structure can I butt up against? Where is the end? Where do you start and where do I begin, right? Like, they want very clear understandings of how much power is theirs and how much is yours. And so one of the things I think I have to explain to parents a lot of times, if you have a child who's like this, is A, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything's wrong. And B, when I say power, I don't mean authoritarian kind of power. I'm just talking about the ability to anchor and steady yourself and be able to just explain that, no, you can't have that. And stick with that boundary and not get rattled when they come back at you with these big, exhaustive tantrums. But instead, let's teach them how to reset their bodies. Let's teach them how to take a break. Let's build in consequences. Kids need consequences. I'm not talking about punishments. I'm not talking about anything punitive in nature. I'm not talking about using shaming or fear tactics. I'm simply saying that kids need consequences to actions that they do. That's how we all learn, truly. So the thing I want you to reframe, and this gets to my next point. So the point number one is, do you just kind of look at your kid and ask yourself, do they really value approval? Because if that's the model you keep using and they keep fighting against it and you keep using it, it's a complete mismatch, because essentially you keep trying to go back to this idea of like, let me get them to fit into this approval-based modeling or parenting. And they're like, that's not what I need. I actually lose control, and I need to know who's not afraid when I'm losing control, who's just as strong as me, who can steady me in those moments. Where is my anchor? Where is my person to kind of keep me in a safe state? So essentially what you want to think about is, one, if you have a child then where approval isn't the thing that they value, then we want to shift the way we're connecting with our child. We want to shift the way we're doing it. And this leads me to the second point. 9 out of 10 times, most parents will use explanations as a way to deter challenging behaviors. With a strong-willed child, very rarely do explanations work. And here is why. Number one, I just want to highlight, it's really well intended, and I know why we do it. We want to make sure that our kids have the tools and the knowledge to make better choices. We likely grew up at a time where no one really explained anything to us. You either got in trouble, maybe you knew why, maybe you didn't. You did as you were told. There wasn't a lot of space where people were saying things and explaining things and walking you through behaviors, and certainly not your emotions. Nobody was talking to you about that. And if you had to express a negative emotion, you were likely reprimanded, punished, left alone, told to stop immediately. So what we want to think about is, number one, an explanation gives information, right? So the assumption is, my child engaged in a negative behavior, let's say it's hitting, because clearly they must not know that hitting isn't a good thing. It can hurt the other person. So let me sit down and have a really robust explanation around hitting. The problem with that is they don't lack the knowledge of it, the knowledge piece of it. They're not lacking the information. That's not the thing that motivated the behavior. The thing that motivated the behavior could be several other things. We could be looking at impulse control. We could be looking at a child who can't demonstrate self-regulation. So when they get emotional, they might hit. We might be looking at a child who can't tolerate frustration. So as a result, they hit. It could be a child where maybe there's different sensory inputs and it overwhelms them, and maybe their knee-jerk reaction is to hit. There are a lot of reasons why kids hit. Usually, it isn't because they didn't know hitting was bad. Meaning, if you pull your child aside and you give them a really long explanation, you're like, hey, when we hit, the other person's body gets hurt and it also hurts their feelings. It's not a kind way to treat somebody. We're much better off using our words and asking for the thing that we want, right? So you can try this. And if it's truly lack of information, what you should see is a complete reduction in hitting. Because if the child just didn't know that hitting was bad, the next time they go to hit, they'll be like, oh, I'm not going to do that because it's bad. Or that's not the thing I'm supposed to be doing, because they're armed with the information. But that's not why they're hitting. In fact, I would say most strong-willed kids are also so intelligent. They're so highly intelligent. So we're not looking at a situation where, in this case, the explanation is going to deter the behavior. So what ends up happening is you're giving explanations, you're explaining all these things. They might even be agreeable because they're so smart. They just don't want to get in trouble. They're like, okay, yeah. Okay, got it. Noted. I won't hit again. And then when presented with that same set of circumstances, they'll likely engage in the same behavior. So what I'm getting at is we want to reframe this idea that explanations are going to help our child stop doing said behavior. Instead, we want to get to the root of what's under it. Do they need emotional regulation tools? Is it that they, some of those other things? Do we have to work on impulse control? What skill are they needing to develop so that they don't engage in that behavior? If we can get to the underbelly of what's going on, you should see a reduction in the behavior that you don't want to see. But again, the explaining piece usually in most cases can make it worse, because we generally try to offer the explanation when our child is in a heightened emotional state. So your child hits, you're trying to pull them away, they're still pretty wrapped up in the emotions of whatever that moment was, and you start coming in with your explanation around why hitting is bad. They're not available to hear you right now. Their bandwidth isn't available. They're dysregulated. Their sensory system is taxed. And now us talking only causes more escalation. So it might feel like, well, then what are we supposed to do, right? Like, we want to help them. We don't want them to hit. We don't want them to do these behaviors. The first thing, and this is going to get me right into my third point, right? So if you're using explanations, stop. If you are looking at the way you parent and you're wishing and willing them to shift over into an approval-based system, that's not who they are. So we're going to kind of go over to the other side, and we're going to think a little bit more about the idea of your child valuing power. And then we're going to think about this idea that what I mentioned earlier, when they value power, they really feel out of control when they become dysregulated. And what they're desperately hoping for is there has to be some boundary around me. There has to be somebody who won't get phased. If we get escalated with them when they begin to escalate, the interpretation on the child's part is that, okay, everyone around me, when I'm out of control and I can't manage what's going on, everyone around me is also out of control. Everyone else around me is screaming, yelling, mad, anxious, right? They probably don't have those words, but that is the sensation that they're getting, is that everyone's energy level is off when I go through this. So the third takeaway that I want you to hear today, and again, if you're interested, I'm going to go over so much more about this in the group coaching program, but is the idea of being able to self-regulate yourself. So usually when we're responding to a strong-willed child, it's incredibly triggering. So we erupt, we escalate with them, and just like what I said, if they're already in a dysregulated state, they're looking around going, oh my gosh, when I'm like this, nobody's in control. Nobody's managing this. Nobody has the power to manage this. So again, although they value power, at the same time, they're also afraid of what it does to them in moments of dysregulation. So this is where we come in. And what we have to do is, one, create a really consistent, predictable structure through boundaries. And this takes time. There's a reason I work with families for 2 months at a time. It won't change overnight. You want to lean into small changes little by little so that you get better and better at it, and your child can have the time that he or she needs to work through those emotions that are coming up. We also have to think about what our expectations are and adjusting those as needed. You want to be really clear and concise in your language. We don't have to be really wordy. So you want to be able to say things like, this is what we're going to do today. Here is the expectation when we go to the park. Here is what I need you to need to see when you're playing with your peers. If it turns into a physical activity, if you can't keep hands on your body, I will come and pick you up and I will take a seat with you by the bench so we can reset our bodies. Again, we're not saying they're in trouble for the emotion, but we can't allow any behavior. It can't be a free-for-all because they're sad or upset or mad, right? We have to balance those two things out. Then once we have a reset and you can sit calmly for 1 full minute, again, if you go back and listen to that episode with Joe Newman, you'll know what I'm talking about in terms of a reset. But essentially, it's just our way of building in a consequence attached to the behavior we don't want to see. We remove them from a situation. They stop being able to engage in whatever it is that they're doing. Everything halts. You stay with them. You don't do a lot of talking. You allow them to completely come down. So it might look like a roller coaster at first where they scream, and they're so upset. And then and you're just sitting holding space and you validate. I know it's really hard when we have to stop doing something we love. You got this. I need you to calm your body down for 1 full minute and we can go back. And then you're not leaving them alone. It's not the same thing as a timeout. You're not punishing them. You're not like, that's it, time for a reset. I saw what you did. We are helping them gain the skill that they need. So then they can resume once they learn to calm down. Once you do this enough times and it is consistent and it is predictable, it is unbelievable how quickly these strong-willed kids can manage what's coming up for them and how beautifully they start to express themselves in this world. They gain peers, they become leaders of things, they are engaging in a really healthy way. It transforms your relationship with them. You're no longer fatigued and depleted at the end of the day, wondering why every day feels like you're battling with them, but instead you can be on the same page. There are a lot of ways we can continue to foster that free spirit in them. We want that. But we also have to know that what a child is communicating in that moment isn't to just be independent and free. They're actually saying, like, I actually do depend on you, and that is natural. They're still very young. So how can we be that dependable anchor, that calm, steady anchor, so that when they become dysregulated, we can be the one to hold that space for them? You know, I always use the analogy of adults, but if you're really dysregulated and really upset about something and you're really having a tough time just gaining, control or just calming your body down, or you're just feeling all sorts of things, you will not seek out the guidance of the person who will immediately grow emotional with you. Meaning you're not going to go to the friend who's going to become heightened the second you start saying something and reactive and peppering you with questions and telling you to just fix it. And you're going to go to the friend that essentially just sits there and holds your hand and says, I get it. I got you. That's what our kids need. And that is really hard for us because we're not used to seeing a child express these big emotions without interpreting that behavior as a child who isn't quote unquote well behaved or a good child or a compliant child. But instead, that is who they are. They need us to hold that space for them. And they are inherently worthy and wonderful and great little people. They just learn differently. They process their emotions differently. And it's really on us to create that space for them to thrive. So those are the 3 takeaways: approval versus power. We want to look at how often are we giving explanations as the only form of a consequence. And the last one is, how can you regulate yourself in moments of escalation so that your response pattern begins to shift from reactive to more responsive, thoughtful, and calm. And not saying a lot, but feeling really steady. I use that word a lot, and it's intentionally used. There is a steadiness and an ease when we can know that what we're doing is the exact thing our child needs, even if they're dysregulated in that moment. It's on us to really hold that space for them. So again, I will have information in the show notes if you want to do the group coaching program. We cap it at a small size, so don't wait or reach out to me if it already closes. I have so many people interested, and I will see what I can do. But I really want to be able to hold this space for parents because I know how trying it can be. And certainly as we enter the holiday season, I want to at least give you some tools to get through a time of year where kids are more prone to tantrums, they are more prone to dysregulation, routines are compromised, guests are coming in and out of town, maybe you're the one traveling. There's a lot to unpack. So in that group coaching program, I can really support you in a more hands-on way, and I can really be there to answer those questions for you. But again, you can find more details there. And if not, just keep listening. I'll keep talking about it and writing about it and sharing about it in all the different places that I show up. So thank you so much for being here, everyone. Until next time.